I bought an abandoned storage unit at auction for $80. When I cut the lock off, I found 400 envelopes of cash and a ledger with 61 names in it. The 12th name on that list was my mother's. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, wherever you are. It's Clara. Thank you for being here with me again. If you're new, please subscribe, and if you've been with me a while, tap the like button so more people find us. And do me a favor before we start. Tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I read every single one, and there is something about seeing all those places stack up under a story that makes this feel less like talking into a microphone and more like sitting in somebody's kitchen. My name is Nora Vance. I'm 41 years old, I've worked emergency medicine for 16 years, and 3 summers ago I owned a 2009 Corolla with a coat hanger holding the muffler up, and $61,000 of credit card debt that I did not create. Let me get the ugly part out of the way early, because it matters later. I was married for 9 years to a man named Corey Ballard. He was funny. He was the kind of funny where people at parties drift toward the sound of him. He sold commercial HVAC systems, and he was good at it right up until he wasn't. And somewhere in the last 2 years of our marriage, he opened 4 credit cards in my name, took a personal loan against a car that was titled to both of us, and defaulted on all of it. I found out the way most people find out. A collections agent called me at work while I was holding pressure on a stab wound. And I told her I'd call her back, and then I did call her back, and she read me a list of accounts I had never heard of. Corey cried. He said he was going to fix it. He said he was going to make it right, and I believed him for 11 more months, which is the part I still can't fully explain to myself. The divorce was finalized in April. In Arizona, we have community property, which means the debt from a marriage generally follows both people out the door, regardless of whose name is on it. And it means that when your ex-husband disappears to Nevada, the collections calls do not disappear with him. My attorney at the time, a public defender's office refugee who charged me $200 an hour, and I could afford about 6 hours of him, told me I could file for identity theft. But that proving fraud between spouses in a community property state was, and I remember his exact word, expensive. So I did what nurses do. I picked up shifts. I moved out of the house in Sierra Vista and into a 1-bedroom apartment in Douglas, right up against the border, where a place with working air conditioning ran $700 a month. I worked 3 12s at the hospital and picked up 2 more at an urgent care in Bisbee, and I ate the same thing 5 days a week because deciding what to eat cost energy I did not have. Rice, black beans, a fried egg on top. I still make it sometimes. I don't hate it, but I don't eat it in front of other people. That's the version of me that showed up at Sunland Self-Storage on a Saturday morning in July, which in Cochise County means 106 degrees by 10 in the morning and no shade anywhere on God's earth. I was not there for treasure. I want to be honest about that because I think some of you are imagining a woman who chased this. I went to storage auctions for tools. Contractors default on units constantly, and you can buy an $80 unit and pull $400 of DeWalt out of it, if you know what you're looking at. And my father was a diesel mechanic, and I know what I'm looking at. I'd been to 6 auctions that summer. I'd made about $900 total. It was a hobby that paid slightly better than not having one. The yard was owned by a man named Ivan Doroshenko. He was 74 then, came over from Ukraine in 1979, and he ran that place like a Swiss watch that had been left out in the sun. Everything worked. Nothing was pretty. He'd known me by name after my third auction, because I was the only person there who ever brought him a cold Gatorade, which I did because he was 74 and standing in a gravel lot in July. That morning, he moved the auction up 30 minutes. He announced it to the 6 of us standing around and said, in that flat accent that never once softened in 45 years, I am not going to watch somebody die of heat for a unit of Christmas decorations. Nobody argued. There were 4 units. 2 were obvious junk. One had a motorcycle frame in the back that got bid up to $400 and change. And then he rolled up the door on unit 114. It was almost empty. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Storage auctions are theater. Buyers stand at the door. They get 60 seconds to look with a flashlight, and they're reading the room like a hand of cards. A full unit means somebody's whole life is in there, and some of it might be worth something. An empty unit means the previous tenant already came and took what mattered. Unit 114 had a beige 4-drawer filing cabinet against the back wall, a metal folding chair, 3 cardboard boxes taped, a pair of work boots. That was it in a 10 by 20. Nobody bid. Ivan said 80 and looked at us, and the guy who bought the motorcycle laughed, and I raised my hand mostly because I felt bad for the empty room. $80. Ivan wrote my name on a bid sheet on a clipboard, along with my phone number, because that's what you do, and that clipboard sat on a shelf in an unlocked office. Remember that. A lot of people have asked me since how anybody got my number. That's how. It wasn't magic. It was a clipboard. He also told me the unit had belonged to a man named Harlan Boyd, who died in 2021, and whose family had stopped paying the $85 a month about 18 months after that. Ivan said Boyd used to come in and sit in that unit, not retrieve anything. Sit. In the folding chair, with the door open, in the shade, for an hour at a time. Ivan thought it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen on his property, and he'd been there since 1988. I paid cash. I got the key. I said I'd come back for the cabinet with a truck. I drove back out that afternoon, with a hand truck borrowed from my neighbor and the AC in the Corolla blowing lukewarm, and it was 109 by then, and I remember thinking that if I got heat stroke over a filing cabinet, I would deserve whatever the ER staff said about me. The boxes were tax returns. 1994 through 2008, in perfect order, rubber banded by year. The boots were size 11 and had been resoled twice. The filing cabinet was locked, not a flimsy office lock. Somebody had drilled through the frame and run a hardened steel hasp across the front of all 4 drawers and put a padlock on it, the kind you can't cut with bolt cutters, the kind you have to grind. And that padlock was clean. Not shiny, but clean. No rust, in a county where everything metal turns orange in a season. I stood in that unit, and I looked at a filing cabinet that had been secured like a gun safe by a man who paid $85 a month for 8 years to sit in a chair next to it. I could have called somebody. I want you to sit with the fact that I didn't. I went to the truck bay, borrowed Ivan's angle grinder, told him I couldn't get it open, and he said, "It is your cabinet," and went back to his crossword. It took 11 minutes and threw sparks all over a concrete floor. The top drawer was envelopes, plain white number 10 envelopes, standing on edge, packed front to back like a card catalog, each one with a date written on it in blue ballpoint, and inside each one, banded, was cash. 20s and hundreds mostly. Some had $1,100 in them. Some had $4,000. The dates went from 1996 to 2019. 3 drawers of envelopes. And in the bottom drawer alone was a ledger. Green cloth cover, the accounting kind you buy at a stationery store, and it had been used by a man with beautiful handwriting and no imagination. Columns, names, addressa, amount advanced, rate, payment received by date. And a final column he'd labeled in that same careful hand, DISP. I didn't understand DISP for another 2 weeks. 61 names. Cochise County, all of it. Douglas, Bisbee, Elfrida, McNeil, Sierra Vista, Purtleville. And on line 12 in blue ink in handwriting that had been dead for 2 years. Vance, Eileen M. 1418 Palominas Red. That was my mother. I sat down on Harlan Boyd's folding chair, in Harlan Boyd's storage unit, in the hottest part of the hottest month of the year, and I read across the row. Amount advanced, $9,000, June 2013. Rate, and here he'd written it plainly, 22% Mo, payments received. A column of small numbers, 300, 300, 300, 400, on and on for 3 years. And under DISP, one word. Deed. My mother lost her house in 2016. She told me it was medical bills. She told me that for 7 years. I sat in that chair a long time. I remember the sound of a swamp cooler somewhere in the yard, cycling on and off, and a jet crossing high overhead leaving a line. And I remember thinking very clearly that I had just bought the reason my mother rents. Here's the part I need to say carefully, because it's the part people argue about in the comments, and I've read those arguments, and some of you would have done differently. I did not take that money home. I know how that sounds. There was, I found out later, $1,840,000 in that cabinet, and I stood there $61,000 in debt, eating rice and beans, and I closed the drawers, because the ledger changed everything. If it had just been money, I might have thought about it differently. I'd like to say I wouldn't have, but I've been a nurse long enough not to lie about what people do when nobody's watching. But it wasn't just money. It was a list, and my mother was on the list, and that meant every one of those envelopes had a person attached to it. And I didn't know yet what had happened to those people. I went to Ivan's office. I told him I needed to change the lock on 114, and I needed to know if his cameras covered that row. They did. 2 of them, and he'd upgraded to a real system 4 years earlier, after somebody stole a boat trailer. I bought a new padlock at the hardware store on G Avenue, put it on, and I photographed every page of that ledger on the concrete floor with my phone, 61 names, front and back, and then I put the ledger back in the drawer and locked the door and drove home with nothing. Then I called Rosalie Bautista. Rosalie is a nurse. She came over from Cebu in 2004, and she has worked more night shifts than anyone I've ever met, and she has never once been rattled by anything, including the night we had 4 gunshot wounds and a woman in labor at the same time. She listened to me for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then she said, "Nora, do not tell anyone else. Get a lawyer tomorrow, not a lawyer from here." I asked her why not from here. She said, "Because a man does not lend money to 61 people in one county for 23 years without somebody at the bank knowing about it." I have thought about that sentence probably 400 times since. The lawyer I found was named Renata Salazar. She practiced in Tucson, 90 minutes northwest, and her website said she handled probate disputes, elder financial exploitation, and, in a phrase that made me call her, unusual property claims. She had gray in her hair and a habit of writing while you talked without ever breaking eye contact, which I found unnerving until I realized she'd been doing it for 30 years. I told her the whole thing in her conference room on a Tuesday. The auction, the $80, the grinder, the envelopes, the ledger, my mother. When I finished, she put her pen down and asked me one question. "Nora, does anyone know your name?" I said Ivan had it on a clipboard. She nodded slowly and said, "Then we assume everyone has it." Renata explained the law to me the way you explain a diagnosis to a patient, which is to say she told me the truth and then told me what we could do about it. Under Arizona law, when you buy a defaulted storage unit at a lien sale, you buy the contents, not the tenant's other property, not his bank accounts, but the contents. Cash in a filing cabinet in that unit was, on its face, contents. That was the good news. The bad news was threefold. If the cash could be traced to criminal proceeds, the state could move to forfeit it. If living victims could be identified, and 61 names is a lot of identification, they might have restitution claims that would come out of that money. And if Harlan Boyd's estate had been probated improperly, or if the storage lien's sale had a procedural defect, an heir could try to unwind the whole sale. So it might be mine, I said. It might be partly yours, she said, and the fastest way to lose all of it is to touch it. She told me to file a report with the sheriff's office that same day, not because I was required to exactly, but because the single most valuable thing I could build in the next 48 hours was a timestamp. A record that showed a woman found a large amount of cash and walked directly to law enforcement and did not sleep one night with it under her bed. I filed it that afternoon at the Cochise County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took the report was young and kept saying, "How much?" And eventually he made a phone call, and then another one. And 90 minutes later, I was sitting across a desk from Sheriff Ruben Camacho, a broad, quiet man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head. He sent 2 deputies out to the yard with me. They photographed the unit, counted the envelopes without opening them, logged the ledger into evidence with a receipt in my name, and sealed the cabinet. And then Sheriff Camacho stood in Unit 114 in the last of the daylight, looking at that filing cabinet, and he said something that I felt in my back teeth. We had a complaint about Harlan Boyd in 2016. I asked what happened to it. He said a woman came in and said she'd been charged interest that couldn't be legal, and she brought a handwritten receipt, and the deputy who took it referred it to the county attorney's office as a civil matter. And it was closed in 11 days. "Do you remember her name?" I asked. He said no, but he'd look. I already knew. There were only 2 women's names in that ledger from Purtleville. Somebody had tried to stop this 7 years earlier and been told it was a civil matter. I got the text that night, sitting in the parking lot of the apartment complex with the engine off because I didn't want to go inside yet. Unknown number. You should give that back to the family. Don't make this hard. I screenshotted it. I forwarded it to Renata. I sat in a dark car in 101-degree heat at 10 at night, and my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone into the footwell. Then I picked it up, and I opened my notes app, and I wrote down the exact time, and what the text said, and what I had done in the previous 6 hours, and who had seen me do it. Precision is what I have instead of courage. It's what I do at work when a kid comes in blue. You don't feel brave. You just go in order. The next morning, Renata called me before 8. She'd pulled the probate file on Harlan Boyd, and she'd pulled something else. Boyd's mortgage discharges, because the man had held paper on properties all over the county, and every single one of those deeds of trust had been prepared by the same institution. Cochise Valley Community Bank. She'd also found, filed in 2013, an assignment of a beneficial interest on one of those deeds, signed by Harlan Boyd, notarized by a bank officer, assigned to a trust called Palo Verde Land Trust. The trustee of Palo Verde Land Trust was a man named Wade Kessler. I knew who Wade Kessler was. Everyone in Cochise County knows who Wade Kessler is. He was 58. He was the president of Cochise Valley Community Bank. His name was on the scoreboard at the high school football field. In Douglas, he sponsored the 4th of July fireworks, and his wife ran the Christmas toy drive out of the bank lobby. When my mother lost her house, Wade Kessler's bank sent her a card. I want you to understand what it does to you to see a name like that in a document like that. Renata told me not to do anything. Renata told me she was going to make some calls. Renata told me, specifically and slowly, to stay away from the yard, to stay away from Kessler, and to go to work and do my job. And I did all of that for exactly 2 days, and then I drove to Sierra Vista to see my mother, because there was one part of this that was mine. Eileen Vance is 68. She raised 2 daughters mostly alone. She rents a 2-bedroom off Fry Boulevard with a saguaro in a pot on the porch that she has kept alive for 11 years. She was making chicken and dumplings when I came in, and she made me eat before she'd talk about anything, which is a thing she does. I showed her the photograph of line 12. She looked at it for a long time with her reading glasses on. Then she took them off and folded them and set them on the table and put both hands flat on either side of them, and she said, "Who else has seen this? Not what is this? Not where did you get this? Who else has seen this?" And I understood right then that the thing my mother had been protecting for 7 years was not a secret. It was her dignity, she told me. It came out over about 2 hours, and there were long silences in it. In 2013, she'd had a gap. She'd had knee surgery, she'd used up her leave, and her disability paperwork sat in some office for 4 months. And she was 58 years old, and behind on a mortgage she'd been paying for 19 years. And a woman at church told her about a man in Douglas who helped people. He came to the house. He was pleasant, she said. He wore a pressed shirt. He said he did this because the banks wouldn't. He gave her $9,000 in cash in an envelope, and she signed 1 page. She thought she was signing a promissory note. She was signing a deed of trust with a power of sale. She paid him $300 a month for 3 years. 36 payments, $10,800 against a $9,000 loan. And she still owed $9,000 because everything she paid was interest, and it was interest at 22% per month. In 2016, she missed 2 payments and a notice came, and she went to her bank, the bank she'd had a checking account with since 1987. And she sat down with a loan officer, and she showed him the paper and asked him to help her. She said the loan officer was very kind. She said he told her it was a valid instrument and there was nothing the bank could do, and he walked her out to the lobby himself, and he asked after me. "Do you remember his name?" I asked her. My mother looked at the wall for a while. "Wade," she said. "He gave me a candy from the dish." I did not cry in front of my mother. I drove 20 minutes toward Douglas and pulled off onto the shoulder of Highway 80 with the hazards on, and cried in a way I hadn't since I was a child. And a Border Patrol agent stopped to check on me, and I told him I was fine, and he waited until I pulled back onto the road, which was decent of him. Then I went back to work and got very, very organized. Here's where things escalated, and I'll be plain about the sequence because people ask. 4 days after I saw my mother, my apartment was entered. I was on a night shift. My neighbor's dog didn't bark, which she told me later, like it was a confession. Nothing was taken. My television was sitting there. But the manila folder on my kitchen table, auction receipt, sheriff's evidence receipt, Renata's engagement letter, had been moved, and I know it had been moved because I am the kind of person who squares a folder to the edge of a table. They didn't find the ledger photographs because the ledger photographs were in a cloud account and also on a thumb drive taped inside a box of tampons under the bathroom sink, which is a hiding place I recommend to every woman I've ever met. I called the sheriff. I photographed everything. I did not go back inside to sleep. I stayed at Rosalie's for 11 days, and she made me eat and did not ask me questions, and let me sit on her couch and watch a Filipino cooking channel until 2 in the morning. Then the phone call. It came on a Sunday, unknown number. I was recording every call by then. Arizona is a one-party consent state, and Renata had confirmed I could, and I answered it in Rosalie's kitchen with the water running so I could hear the difference in my own voice. Nora Wade Kessler. Warm. Easy, like a man calling to ask about a bake sale. He said he'd heard I'd come into some difficulty. He said Harlan Boyd had been an old friend of the bank, and that there were, in his words, some private arrangements that touched on institutional interests, and he thought it would be wise for the two of us to have a conversation before lawyers made everything expensive. He said, "I remember your mother." "Fine woman," I said. "Please call my attorney." And I hung up and I put my head down on Rosalie's kitchen table for a minute, and then I sat up and typed out every word of it while it was fresh. Renata's reaction when she heard the recording was the first time I ever heard her sound pleased. "He identified himself," she said. "He referenced your mother on a recorded line. Nora, he has never in his life had to be careful. That is going to cost him." She was right, but not for another 5 months. What she needed was the paper. The ledger showed loans and payments and a column labeled DISPIP. It showed deed next to 11 names, including my mother's, and PA next to 19, and next to 12 names, a word that Renata told me to sit down before she read to me. Rot off deck. Deceased. 12 of the 61 people on Harlan Boyd's list had died still owing him money, and he had written them off in blue ballpoint like a man balancing a checkbook. But a ledger by itself proves a kept ledger. To connect it to the bank and to Kessler, we needed the instruments, the actual signed paper, and the sheriff's inventory of Unit 114 didn't have any. I went back to the boxes, not the storage unit. That was sealed in the county's custody. I mean the boxes of tax returns that I'd carried up to my apartment on the first day because they were light, and I hadn't looked at them since. I sat on my living room floor on a Wednesday in September and went through 15 years of Harlan Boyd's Schedule Cs. And it was the most boring afternoon of my life until I got to 2003, and the rubber band was doubled, and inside the folded 1040 there was a King James Bible. Small, black leather, somebody's confirmation gift with a name in gilt on the cover that wasn't Boyd's. The inside had been cut out. Somebody had taken a razor to about 200 pages and made a rectangular well, and inside it, folded into eighths, were 9 documents: deeds of trust, assignments, a 1-page agreement dated March 2001, handwritten, signed by Harlan Boyd and by Wade Kessler, laying out that Boyd would originate what the paper called accommodation loans to bank customers who had been declined, that Kessler would identify the borrowers and prepare the instruments, and that the proceeds would be split 60% to Boyd and 40% to what the document referred to as the trust. And there was a clause. I read it 4 times. It said that in the event of the death of either party, the arrangement terminated and all interests reverted to the survivor, and that neither party's heirs, assigns, or successors would have any claim. Harlan Boyd died in 2021. Wade Kessler was the survivor, which meant Wade Kessler believed that $1,840,000 in a filing cabinet in Douglas, Arizona, belonged to him. And he had never gone and gotten it, because to walk into that unit, he would have had to be a man who knew what was in it. He'd been waiting for the storage lien sale. Ivan told me later that a man he didn't recognize showed up at the yard at 10:30 that Saturday morning, and the auction had ended at 10:15, and the man got out of his truck and looked at the empty gravel lot for a while, and then got back in and drove away. 30 minutes. Because a 74-year-old Ukrainian man didn't want anybody dying of heat in his gravel. I photographed all 9 documents on my kitchen table with a ruler for scale, the way Renata had taught me, uploaded them, and then I drove them straight to the sheriff's office and handed them across the counter and got a receipt. And only then did I call Renata, and she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Nora, everything changes now, and I need you to understand something. That agreement is evidence of a criminal enterprise, which means the county attorney is going to be very interested, and forfeiture is going to be on the table, and your claim to that money is going to depend on how you behave for the next 6 months." I said I understood. She said, "Also, you should assume he's going to come see you. He came on a Saturday morning in October, which is the first month of the year that Cochise County is beautiful. I had moved back into my apartment by then. The cabinet was in county custody, the ledger was in evidence, and a Superior Court judge had entered an order preserving the funds pending resolution of competing claims. I was working my shifts. I was refinishing a dresser I'd bought for $15 because I have to have something to do with my hands. There was a knock at 10. Through the peephole, I saw Wade Kessler in a golf shirt, and beside him a woman about 60 in a good linen blazer. I want to be very clear about that because I've had people ask me why the woman in the story always opens the door. I have a security door, the kind with the steel scrollwork that every apartment in southern Arizona has, and I opened the inner door and left the security door latched, and I stood behind it with my phone recording in my shirt pocket. Rosalie was sitting on my couch with the volume off. My neighbor was on her porch 12 feet away, watering plants very slowly. "Nora," Kessler said, like we were old friends, "this is my sister, Marlene Kessler Ford." The woman gave me a look of enormous sympathy. She had it ready. "We just wanted to talk to you as people," she said. "Not as lawyers." Kessler said he understood I'd been through a lot. He said this whole business had gotten away from everybody. He said Harlan Boyd had been an old man and that his records were, and here he chose his word carefully, imprecise. He said the money in that unit represented decades of legitimate lending activity that had unfortunately been documented in a manner that could be misconstrued. And then he said, "Legally, I'm told this could go a lot of ways. But morally, Nora, that money came from work my family did in this county for 40 years. Morally. That's the word. When somebody says morally to you across a locked door, what they're telling you is that they've already talked to their attorney, and their attorney told them no." Marlene stepped forward. "We're not asking for all of it," she said, in the voice of a person granting an enormous kindness. "A third. We'd sign anything you want. No press, no more court, no more of this hanging over your head. You'd keep the majority, and we'd all get to go back to our lives." I stood behind that steel door for what felt like a long time. Then I said, "Mr. Kessler, my mother sat in your lobby in 2016 and showed you a piece of paper and asked you for help." The sympathy went off Marlene's face like somebody flipped a switch. Kessler's expression didn't change at all. That's the part I remember. Not anger, nothing. Like a screen going to black. "You gave her a candy from the dish," I said. "Do you know what dispith means? It's a column. In a ledger. It stands for disposition, and under it, next to her name, he wrote deed. That's what happened to my mother's house. And I want to ask you, since we're talking morally, what did the bank do with it? Marlene said, "You need to understand what you're doing to this family, I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said. "You're a nurse," she said, and her voice had gone somewhere else entirely. "You have a license. This is a small county, Nora. People here have known us for 4 generations. And you are a woman who bought a filing cabinet." "Marlene," Kessler said. One word, quiet. But it was out, and all 3 of us heard it. And so did my phone, and so did my neighbor with the watering can, who told me later she'd stopped pretending to water about a minute in. I said, "I think you should get off my walkway." They did. He nodded once, and they walked to a white Suburban, and I closed the inner door and locked it. And then I went and sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs quit. Rosalie came and sat on the floor next to me. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "You did that with a door between you. Next time, use a lawyer." I called Renata and played her the recording, and she was silent, and then she said, in a voice of pure, cold satisfaction, "She threatened your professional license. On tape, in front of a witness. Nora, that is not a family with a claim. That is a family with a habit." The hearing was in February. By then, the county attorney's office had been working for 4 months. A deputy county attorney named Adele Trask had the case, and she was maybe 35, and she had the manner of someone who has been underestimated professionally so many times that she'd stopped noticing. Here's what I knew going in. Renata had filed a claim on my behalf as a good-faith purchaser at a lawful lien sale. The state had filed a forfeiture action against a portion of the funds. Kessler's attorney, a Phoenix man named Grant Mabry, had filed a motion to suppress the 9 documents from the Bible on the theory that I had exceeded the scope of the storage lien sale when I opened a locked container. That motion had been denied in November, and a forensic accountant had spent 11 weeks with the ledger and the bank's own records, obtained by subpoena, matching Boyd's blue ink entries against deposits into an account belonging to Palo Verde Land Trust. I sat in that courtroom in a navy blazer I'd bought at a consignment store on Naco Highway. My mother sat beside me. She had insisted. She wore her church clothes. Adele Trask walked the judge through the timeline. The auction. The cabinet. The immediate report to the sheriff 41 minutes after I photographed the ledger. She said the number twice. And I understood then why Renata had been so insistent about that first afternoon. The text message. The break-in. The recorded call. The doorstep. Then she introduced the accountant's findings, which established that between 2001 and 2019, deposits into Palo Verde Land Trust corresponded to 60%. She paused to 40% of the payment entries in Harlan Boyd's ledger, within a variance of under 2%. Then she said, "Your Honor, the state calls Ivan Doroshenko." I had not known. He came up the aisle in a suit that had fit him in about 1991, and he took the oath with his hand very steady, and he testified that a man had come to his office in 2022 asking about Unit 114 and asked whether he could pay the arrears and take possession of the contents. And Ivan had told him that under Arizona law, only the tenant or his estate could redeem, and the man had left a business card. Adele Trask entered the business card into evidence. Cochise Valley Community Bank. Wade Kessler, president. Grant Mabry stood up and objected on relevance, and the judge overruled him, and Mabry sat down, and I watched Wade Kessler turn his head about 10 degrees and look at his lawyer with an expression I've only ever seen on people in the trauma bay, when they realize the leg is not going to be saved. But that wasn't it. That wasn't the moment. Adele Trask said, the state would also note that a witness under a limited immunity agreement, a former loan officer at Cochise Valley Community Bank, has provided a sworn statement that between 2009 and 2017, she was instructed, on 11 occasions, to refer declined mortgage applicants to a business card kept in the top drawer of the branch manager's desk. She has identified that card. She will testify that she was told these were, quote, community accommodations. My mother reached over and took my hand. I have delivered bad news to families for 16 years. I know what a room sounds like when the air changes. That courtroom went dead quiet, and I looked at the back of Wade Kessler's head, and I thought about a bank lobby in 2016 and a bowl of butterscotch candies. The judge denied Kessler's claim to the funds from the bench. The rest took another 8 months, and I'm going to tell you the numbers, because I've noticed nobody ever tells you the numbers. Wade Kessler was indicted on 9 counts. He pleaded to 3, conspiracy to commit fraudulent schemes and artifices, and 2 counts of theft by extortion related to what he did after I found the cabinet. He was sentenced to 4 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. He will be eligible for release before this video is a year old. The bank was not charged. Institutions rarely are. It was acquired by a regional holding company 11 months later, and the people who worked there kept their jobs, which I am glad about, and Kessler's family kept their house in Sierra Vista. And Marlene Kessler Ford was never charged with anything, because a threat made through a security door is a difficult thing to prosecute. I had to sit with that. I still sit with it. Some of you are going to comment that it isn't enough, and you're right, it isn't. Renata told me something that helped a little. She said, "Nora, the sentence is not the punishment. The record is the punishment. That man has spent 30 years buying a reputation, and you took it in 14 months. The money. Of the $1,840,000, the court found that $712,000 was directly traceable to the ledger's identified borrowers and ordered it into a restitution fund. Of the 61 names, 22 people were still living. 19 were located. Renata handled 12 of them personally and did not charge one of them $1. And I have never told her that I know that, and she'll never watch this. So it's safe here. Another $196,000 was forfeited to the state as proceeds of a criminal enterprise because it couldn't be traced to anyone. The remaining $932,000 was awarded to me as the good faith purchaser of the contents of Unit 114. Renata's firm took 25% on contingency, which was $233,000, and which she earned twice over. Federal and state tax on found property. And yes, found property is taxable income in the United States. In the year you take unrestricted possession, took another $291,000, and I paid a CPA in Tucson $4,000 to make sure I never had to think about it again. I walked away with a little over $400,000, not $3 million, not $2. $404,000, and I want you to know that number because I have read a lot of stories where a woman finds a fortune, and I have never once read the tax section. Here's what I did with it. I paid off $61,000 of debt that a man named Corey Ballard put in my name. It took one wire transfer and 11 minutes on the phone. Corey called me in June. Of course he did. He'd read about the sentencing in the Arizona Daily Star, and he called from a Nevada number, and he was so warm, so easy, and he asked how I was and let a beat pass, and then he said that Arizona was a community property state and that he'd been thinking about what was fair. I didn't yell. I want that on the record. I said, "Corey, on August 4th you'll receive a certified letter from Renata Salazar's office. It contains a forensic accounting of 4 credit accounts and 1 auto loan, the notarized handwriting analysis, and a copy of the identity theft affidavit I filed with the Sierra Vista Police Department in 2019. The county attorney's office up here has a copy too, because it came into their file as collateral evidence. I never asked them to do anything with it. There was a very long silence. I said, "Don't call me again," and I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen, and I was 38% sad and 62% free, and those are numbers I've never been able to improve on. I bought my mother a house, not the one on Palominas Road. That one had been resold twice, and it wasn't hers anymore in any way that mattered. I bought her a small stucco place in Sierra Vista, with a wall around the back patio and enough room for 11 pots of things she'll keep alive for another 20 years. She stood in the kitchen the day we closed, and she didn't say anything for a while, and then she said, "I should have told you," and I said, "You should have told me." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. And then, in November, Ivan Doroshenko told me he was selling Sunland Self-Storage. He was 75. His knees were finished. He'd had an offer from a company out of Phoenix that was going to bulldoze the office and put up a sign with a cartoon lock on it. I bought it, $260,000, seller financed, which he insisted on, at 4%, which was below market, and which I argued with him about and lost. I run a storage yard now. I still work 2 shifts a week at the hospital because I'm a nurse, and that's not a thing you stop being. But most mornings I'm out there at 6:30 before the heat, checking locks, and I know every tenant's name. Unit 114 is empty. It'll stay empty. I keep the folding chair in it. I sit in it sometimes, with the door rolled up, in the shade, the way Harlan Boyd used to, and I've thought a lot about what he was doing in there. I used to think he was gloating, counting. I don't think that anymore. He wrote everything down, every name, every payment, every disposition. 61 people, in beautiful handwriting, for 23 years. Nobody made him do that. There was no auditor. There was no partner asking. Wade Kessler certainly never wanted a ledger to exist. I think Harlan Boyd sat in that chair next to a locked cabinet full of money he could never spend and never explain, next to a book with 12 dead people's names written off in his own hand. And I think he was waiting for somebody to grind that lock off. He couldn't undo it. He was in too deep and too old and too much of who he'd become. So he did the only thing left, which was to keep a perfect record and pay $85 a month to make sure it survived him. That's the closest thing to a confession a man like that knows how to write. The monsoon came late that year. It always feels like it isn't coming, and then one afternoon the sky over the Mule Mountains turns the color of a bruise, and the whole valley smells like creosote before the first drop even lands. I stood in the door of the office and watched the rain come across the gravel in a line. And I thought about a woman eating rice and beans in a one-bedroom in Douglas, and I did not envy her, and I did not pity her either. She got me here. I didn't run. I didn't hide anything. I wrote down the time of every phone call, and I photographed every page. And 41 minutes after I understood what I was holding. And none of that was brave. It was just stubborn. And it was orderly. And I have come to believe that orderly is what stubborn looks like when it's tired. So tell me, $80, a locked cabinet, almost $2 million in cash, and a list with your mother's name on it, and a man everybody in town loves standing at your door, offering you a third of it to make the whole thing go away. What would you have done? Would you have called the sheriff or closed the drawer and driven home? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.